Okay, so I'll just give that brief introduction again to orient everyone. Hi, welcome. This is the October COVES Community of Practice call. We build this kind of as the convening that we would typically have if the ASTC conference were in person, and we'd all get together and we'd do some COVES debriefs and share some other conference resources. But since we're in this great habit of meeting monthly on our virtual platform, we thought we would just do something very similar. Alex and I have some brief data share outs to begin with, and then we'll open it up to just general conference sharings, whether that's documents or resources or interesting sessions, connections you may have made, some COVES related, maybe some not COVES related. So we'll just see where the conversation takes us. But I will begin with asking Alex to screen share. And the first thing—
Do you want to frame it at all? It just kind of goes right into the chart with the data.
Yeah. So better to look at the many boxes or my face for framing before the slides. So you all remember, hopefully you all remember, that at the beginning of this month of October, we made a change to the core question on the COVES survey, asking for respondent gender. We aligned the response options to actually be gender categories rather than sex categories. We added an explicit non-binary category while keeping prefer to self-describe and prefer not to say. As a result of this, when we made the change in the question format, because it used to be a select all that apply for individuals who identified with multiple binary gender categories or would like to prefer to self-describe in addition to other things, now it's a select one. And so we had to revisit the data that we had captured historically to better understand how to recode some of those things to fit the new response options moving forward. So what Alex will present and what I'll describe to you all is our analysis of the open-ended data for individuals who selected prefer to self-describe and for anyone who selected multiple response options within the Qualtrics database. So the first thing to note here is that there were 158 individuals across all organizations participating since July of 2020, who wrote in any response if they selected prefer to self-describe. I have coded it roughly into 3 categories, which you can see here. I wanted to call them positive, neutral, negative. It didn't really fit, but there were people who were offering valid and from my perspective, constructive additions to their definition of gender, their self-identification of gender. There were some who fell in this neutral category who were kind of pointing something out from a measurement perspective. And then there were others who chose to write something in. Now, whether that was a true identity that I just don't understand, whether it was an attempt to be funny or anything else, it was hard for me to interpret. So I just kind of labeled it not constructive. I don't know, without serious thought and a lot of expert advice, I'm not sure how we would make sense of it. But as you can see, 158 responses over more than 28,000 that we've collected since summer of last year. So on this next slide, we break it down just a little bit further. What do those categories mean? Here you can see that the most commonly written in response had something to do with non-binary, gender fluid, gender neutral. Some people did explicitly describe themselves as trans. Some people wrote in something else that seemed to be valid, having to do with their gender identity. Some people explicitly identified as queer. That neutral category that I said, people pointing out kind of a measurement aspect, we had at least 6 people saying like, you're conflating gender and sex. You're not doing this right. Please fix your response options, which, is actually pretty helpful. And we have since corrected the question. Some people also wrote in pronouns, she, her, hers, things like that. And then on the side that I labeled as confusing or confusion, there were a number of people, thankfully the smallest category here, that I labeled disregard, who put something, what I interpreted to be negative about the way we were framing this question. On the next slide, Alex, we just see some examples of each of these. So, when we look at those constructive or valid gender identities, NB, literally NB, non-binary, gender flux, gender non-conforming is GNC. You can see the many different ways people are identifying. This is really heartening for a couple of reasons. One, again, that 78, that column on the left, non-binary, is now an explicit response option. So by making the change to the question in the way that we are incorporating an identity that the most people who wrote in a valid response have identified with. So that will help us from a measurement perspective be much more accurate in our perspective of respondent gender. And then on the, if you click next, Alex, here you can see some of those neutral responses that I've been describing. Female is not a gender, sex is different from gender. There were a couple of responses that were more lengthy in their explanation, again, sort of helpful. And then those that just identified more with the pronoun piece. And then lastly, on the green, or the not as constructive prefer to self-describe responses, you know, there were some people who said things like, this is a stupid question, why are you asking this? That's all well and good. That doesn't help us understand gender any more than, you know, prefer not to say. And then people who didn't appreciate the way we were approaching this question, which again, I labeled as disregard. There will always be some of those people. That's an artifact of the way we are choosing to be socially inclusionary. But I wanted to be very explicit in the way we were interpreting these data for the perspective of moving forward. So on this next slide, I think it's a lot of words. So I'm not going to read this slide, but I'm going to leave it up here and I'm going to kind of explain. What I just showed you was the coding of all the open-ended responses for prefer to self-describe. If someone only selected prefer to self-describe and wrote in any of those responses, nothing has changed. You know, that's still their primary gender response, and that's great. The problem becomes if they selected male and prefer to self-describe, or female and prefer to self-describe. When we switch to the current question format, which is a select one, we now had to make the decision to code them as male or their prefer to self-describe option, depending on what they wrote, or female. Only one instance of someone selecting male and female and prefer to self-describe. So this is a long-winded way of saying on the slide, the only cases that we actually had to recode manually were 0.5% of all of the responses we've collected in the last year and a half. 117 of those we were able to just recode as prefer to self-describe because they selected that and didn't put any text that led us to believe there was anything strange going on. Most often they left the prefer to self-describe blank, but because they selected multiple gender options, it was not possible for us to just keep it as their binary gender selection. There were 19 responses of these 136 that I'm describing that wrote something in that led us to believe that their selection of prefer to self-describe was more to criticize us on the measurement, put something redundant like a pronoun in addition to selecting a binary category or something else. So we stripped the text in prefer to self-describe and left those coded as their binary gender, male or female, which is now man or woman. So again, this is more information than many of you likely need. It is our attempt to be transparent about the way this new question format has worked. Some of you may see slight frequency differences in this gender distribution when you look at your own data. But again, because this only really applies to 19 people of the 28,816, you will not see anything different in a percentage. You will not see anything different, that causes concern. This is just our attempt to be as critical about the data as possible as we make steps forward in improving our measurement. So that's kind of just a recap of something we mentioned last month and the month before about where our measurement was headed for the survey. And happy to field any questions about this. Maybe they come in the chat, but otherwise I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Sure, yeah, so kind of switching gears. So if you do have questions, like put them in the chat or raise your hand or something, and make sure to get to them. But so what I wanted to do was to share sort of a recap and a little bit of my portion of the session we presented at ASTC. I'm not going to go through, so we presented with Beth Katz from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, Elisa Israel from St. Louis Science Center, and Marjorie Biquette from Science Museum of Minnesota. They actually presented a very similar thing on one of these COP calls, so I'm not going to like go through it in detail, just sort of summarize a little bit. But then I pulled some aggregate data from October 1 of 2020 to September 30th of 2021. So like the most recent year up to Aztec, and did some comparisons and some like light analysis that was sort of responding to some of the data that they were sharing. So a lot of what we were talking about was kind of the comparing COVID to pre-COVID, the difficulty with that and like some of the issues we were running into, as well as the ways that our museums were like responding in real time or very short timelines to just urgent issues that were coming up during the pandemic. So just briefly, this is COVES stuff. You don't need to see that. You know what COVES is. So Beth shared, a little bit about Natural History Museum of LA, and primarily how I would sort of summarize her kind of experiences with it. She saw a lot of differences between pre-COVID and sort of during COVID, not post-COVID, but in sort of visitor demographics and trends. And in particular, she pointed out something about, locals, and just seeing pretty big, changes from quarter to quarter, as well as racial and ethnic differences in visitation, like the proportion of Hispanic or Latinx visitors pre-COVID was about equal and then dropped down and has not quite rebounded yet. Elisa then sort of responded with things didn't really change all that much at all, even though you might have expected them to. So even things like looking at local visitors, you would think at least that you would see more locals during COVID just because of travel restrictions and various things. But it wasn't really what she experienced. Like these bars are all, kind of relatively close to each other. And so it was sort of an interesting foil to what Beth was talking about. And that was sort of true for just a number of different things like adult ages and membership and just all sorts of different things. And then finally, Marjorie talked a little bit about, the ways that they were responding in real time to, to visitor concerns and things like that. And then also looking at some of the changes that SMM noted. So they saw some changes in motivation in terms of even more than before, group focused motivations rather than self-focused motivations, which is like always what we see in the COVES data in the science version of this question with these specific motivations kind of listed out. We always see more group motivations, but it was like sort of even a bigger change. And then so there actually is a question in the, right, okay. So what we were sort of highlighting for the ASTC audience was these different experiences were really just highlighting how much the local context always mattered and matters, but during COVID was just, I think, enhanced, especially with the 3 cities that we were sort of representing through the slides, like Los Angeles and California being one of the most conservative states around COVID restrictions, Missouri a lot less so, opened up sooner, never really reclosed, restrictions were just a lot lighter. And then Minnesota, which was relatively conservative, maybe somewhere in between, but had this added dimension of being, it's just the epicenter of where the civil unrest and the racial justice protests were happening after George Floyd was killed. So it was just like really, really very different things happening in these different cities. But I guess jokingly, I thought, what if we just ignored the local context again and looked at our aggregate data all across? So this is kind of a crazy, don't read it closely chart of a visualization of how many sites collected data over that past year, that October to October kind of period. How many with email, how many with staff, and you can see some people do both. It's just like huge variations in how many people are collecting. Just putting all that together, sort of the yellow on these slides are going to be the last COVES aggregate report, FY19, the last full year we have of aggregate data, compared to this October to September kind of COVID era dual method question. And so one thing that I struggled with a little bit that I would love to know if any of you are thinking about is just when and why might you combine or compare across methods? Like if you used to do in-person data collection like many of us, and then you did email for a while, or if you transitioned between them, or if you're trying to look at, the aggregate, which was mostly, or, kind of a mix of the different methods. And so I actually chose to combine and compare across in a couple of instances, just because it felt like more of a true aggregate, but really kind of in an exploratory sense. So you can just see like the big differences in numbers. 22,000 email surveys collected is insane. So one thing I wanted to look at was at individual institutions, it seemed like the member effect of like members always giving higher ratings to everything all the time had sort of diminished a little bit. Like we saw that at the Museum of Science in some cases, like ratings and things, NPS and OER, like it wasn't necessarily that members were always rating those things higher. In the aggregate, it really did seem like in terms of the Net Promoter Score, here is this first slide, it still is preserved, right? So members are still giving these higher ratings, but maybe the ratings, like the overall Net Promoter Scores, are a little bit lower. So, there could be a lot of reasons for that. The experience of visiting a museum was different during the pandemic. It is a little bit awkward to recommend that your friends and colleagues go visit, a crowded indoor space. I certainly wasn't, I mean, maybe you'd say, oh, they're really safe and you should go, but it was a little bit of a different dynamic. So there could be a number of things that are going on, but it also could be that there was some people had worse visitor experiences in some cases because of safety concerns or crowding or something like that. Crowding is never fun, but it had an added layer of anxiety during COVID. Comparing across members, so in FY19, the aggregate kind of percentage of members was about 28%, non-members was 72%, and looking in aggregate, that was a little bit higher for our kind of COVID sample, which is what a lot of people, I think, hypothesized would happen, and many museums sort of set up for it to happen by having welcoming our members back early and doing member-only kind of preview days or weeks. But it was quite variable across institutions, just with differences in, member patterns. Yeah, again, looking at the Net Promoter Score there, this like generally maybe lower kind of thing. I also looked at overall experience rating and saw this is one where I've combined email and staffed the methods kind of together. So I don't know, sweated a little bit, but I thought it was maybe okay. So if you look at the members, this is FY19 is on top, and then the more recent stuff is on the bottom. Maybe a little bit more typical, like this is kind of similar, except for when you look at like this good or below kind of rating, you're seeing more of that very, not very bad, but for us kind of much less common lower ratings for that overall experience rating, both for members and not members, which is what kind of led me to think, maybe there was more of an element of actual less positive experiences that we were seeing in aggregate of whatever reason, or maybe just something as simple as like you closed a bunch of the exhibits because of COVID and I wanted to see them. So kind of interesting trends there. Let's see, the next one. Oh yeah, so this is COVID era only. Sorry, just gonna skip over that one. So I then looked at race and ethnicity, and kind of it's tough to look at this one in the aggregate just because of the way that our local areas are so different in the local racial and ethnic makeup. But just thinking about Beth's example of the Hispanic and Latinx audience just really dropping and then not kind of going back up, in the aggregate, I didn't really see that same kind of dramatic difference in any case, although there are some small percentage drops in a number of different like non-white racial and ethnic categories, but kind of minor differences overall. So it's sort of interesting to think about in the context of Beth's data especially. And then I believe lastly, I looked at the motivations that we were seeing, kind of responding to what Marjorie was looking at Science Museum of Minnesota, and actually also sort of saw a mirror of what SMM had seen, which was that group motivations, while always quite high in our data, were even more commonly selected. And of course, we did change some of these categories. We added some motivation categories like to relax or relieve stress or to support the museum. But those even though we added them and thought that they might be, more prominent reasons for visiting during COVID, some of our usual suspects still rose to the top, and perhaps even in more prominence than before. There was a lot of individual institution variation in seeing a specific exhibit, program, or show, but there was enough in the aggregate that was actually more common. People kind of being drawn back to the museum maybe for seeing a particular exhibit or something. So I guess what I would kind of shared with the ASTC audience in taking it away was that interpreting data across methods is really hard, which I knew that it would be, but I often struggled to think about where the differences were coming in between our different institutions and where they were coming in because of the method and some sort of sampling difference and just all of the complexities that are entered into that. So it's something that, if any of you have been doing it, again, I would love to know about how you're thinking about it or any, caveats you're always putting on it or whether you're doing it at all. Sharing a little bit about there might be some evidence that some people may have had worse visitor experiences than before overall, or maybe be less likely to recommend visiting the museum, but also that more people than ever, this is a science museum context, we're visiting science museums as a way to simply spend time together. So again, this was for the Science Center, so I didn't include the Art Museum data in this, but for the Association of Science and Technology Centers conference. But I think it'll be really interesting to kind of do that, look at that a little bit as well in the art context, even though we don't have the, previous COVES aggregate data to think about and compare to. Some sites have their own data that they can look at. So that was kind of what I wanted to share with you all that we had presented at the conference. And so if anyone has like thoughts or questions, Ryan and I also have some like resources that we found from different ASTC sessions that we would love to kind of share with you, but they're not really directly COVES related, so we can kind of wait on that. I don't know if folks have any questions or want to respond to the presentation. I would welcome you to do that.
I have a really focused question, so I want to give time in case people have other questions about the full data set. But I can only see 3 faces, so it's hard to tell.
Yeah, we shouldn't limit the types of questions that come up. For those of you that are familiar with this style of meeting, if we were at an in-person conference, we typically break out into small groups, and some of us would talk about data collection, some of us would talk about marketing efforts, some of us would talk about reporting internally, lots of just general questions that have come up. And even though we've talked about them before, like what's old is new again, right? We're all encountering these same things with COVES in a new operational world, if you will. Like it's just, we've had to reframe COVES almost every other month lately to make sure that it's in front and center and that we're responding to the institutional needs. So I would encourage you to just bring up any questions that are, floating around.
We've had to reframe many things almost every other month,
Yeah.
including COVES. The topic that keeps rolling through the minds of the team at the Fleet Science Center in San Diego is related to using email as a collection method moving forward. So if there are any groups that are interested in talking about that, that's a dialogue we're pondering. Possibly related to other people who might also be experiencing leaner staffing scenarios in these times.
You are certainly not alone at the Fleet in having lost, quite a few people, even more recently, just sort of voluntary people switching jobs, happening all sorts of industries, science museums, and museums are no exception.
So while people ruminate on possible questions, Sarah, why don't you go ahead and ask your very specific one?
So my, when you were looking through, when you were showing your slides, Alex, the thing that popped out for me was, as you were showing the race coding, and, you know, saying that generally things didn't shift a lot, but I realized that I think the far right side was that prefer not to say, and wondering about what, you know, why are we getting that? Even as we think about how many responses came in via email, and we're never going to see each other again, most likely, and still, you know, saying prefer not to respond. Just wondering about, you know, all of the political stuff around the census from a few years ago, or like other, you know, wondering about what might be supporting that or driving that in a way that we're seeing in our data.
One thing I would be curious about that I didn't look at is to see whether that was in particular to the race and ethnicity question, or if there was sort of a common change in the amount of people who were selecting that response option for the demographic questions. I don't know. I would like to look at it. But yeah, I think, you know, could certainly be onto something. I know that the beginning of this data was, you know, end of 2020, when there was lots of census talk happening. No, not sure how prominent it was in different people's minds, but it's a whole country effort. So it certainly is one thing that could have been happening.
It's a really good observation, if only because, you know, for anyone who's looked at the instrument recently and revisited that question about race and ethnicity, when we designed the demographic section, we purposefully worked to align as many questions as possible, as you probably know, to the census, so that we could all make local area comparisons about our communities, about who we were representing, in a way that was like easily accessible, right? I can look up Greater Boston if I'm here for the Museum of Science, and then I can use my COVES data and try and make some comparisons that don't have to do with COVES, but enable me to better understand my audience. And if the census changes, or if people's understanding of what's being asked on the census or being asked out in the public world changes, then we will quickly need to follow suit in order to make sure our data are comparable in that way as well. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on.
Should we share any of some of the resources that we kind of gathered from the conference that folks might be interested in?
Absolutely.
I think so. Again, switching gears again, these are not really COVES related, but just things that we thought others might find interesting or useful. And I can share the two I found first. They're all like links to either like Google kind of Drive documents that people were sharing during the conference. So the first one is a panel that was about climate change and addressing climate change and sort of how that happens in our museums. And in particular, it was sort of like a building a Google Doc of resources during the session, which was kind of fun. But one thing that I really liked about it, and you don't have to click into it right now, but there is like 2 or at least, you know, page and a half of journal articles about communication, climate change and communication. And there was a couple in particular that I thought were fascinating, like people's feelings about taking action around climate change. The title of this one was, "How do I feel when I think about taking action? Hope and boredom, not anxiety and helplessness, predict intentions to take climate action." So if anyone is, you know, I'm sure many of us are already or planning to do more climate change related programming, you know, in whatever context we're in, or sort of addressing it through, you know, shows and exhibits. So I just thought it could be a really great resource. But there's a lot of other stuff in here too, books, tools, you know, networks you can join, and there was just really a lot going on. Another one that I was really excited about, this was just something that was shared in like as a resource to look at later in a DEAI clinic session that I was in. Let's see, it's from the Intrepid Museum in New York City, and about how they built relationships with community members living in low-income housing nearby. And it's like a really nice, slick kind of report document, kind of talking about what they did, the process, recommendations for how others could do it, what worked, what didn't, specific examples. It just sounded like such a fascinating kind of case study of how to build those relationships. So I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I made sure to save it because I was like, ooh, that sounds really good. So that's, I know, another topic that a lot of our museums are interested in talking about. So if this case study is helpful to you, I would encourage you to take a look at it. And then Ryan, you found one that I'll put about, you can describe it.
Yeah, so I attended a session that was really about culturally responsive frameworks, particularly in working with youth, Black, Hispanic, youth of color. And so this was designed to give educators, informal educators, kind of this bridge to next generation science standards, ways to think about embedding culturally responsive practices in our own work so that we can improve outcomes like STEM identity, STEM interest through these teachings. The framework that they use, they call the 5E framework. But again, the nice piece about the Google Doc that Alex just posted in the chat is that there is a rubric. The rubric doesn't have to be used to assess anything you're doing. It can be used to help plan future programming events, etc. So it's a really nice checklist to go through how you're approaching any of these events, plannings, whatever. And there's a short references section that allows for additional reading on some of the topics. But again, what I found most helpful was just this ability to kind of go through a checklist in planning. Here at the Museum of Science, outside of COVES, we've been paying a lot of attention to culturally responsive practices, both in education and evaluation. And so this immediately caught my eye, and I thought it would be a helpful resource for many of you as you think about your own work. And we're curious if, I don't know how many of you, if any, I know I saw a few of your names and faces here and there, but if you attended the Association of Science Technology Centers virtual conference, if you attended any good sessions, if you had other resources that you wanted to share, or other connections made.
I don't have specific resources to share just yet. I mean, I could share my screen with something in a minute if y'all want me to, but we have really invested in project management at the Mayborn, and we work with Smartsheet. So there was a whole session on different project management systems and how the different museums are utilizing them to communicate internally and externally. And I know for us, I believe this is our 4th year and continuing to expand our use of it, but it's been a very interesting and helpful tool for lots of reasons. But I thought that session was really interesting just to see how other museums are starting to really dive into the work of project management in their institutions. So that was pretty cool.
Were there any, I guess, like recommendations or winners in terms of, or like different, this one's really good for this and this one's really good for this, or anything like that?
I think it's funny. I think there's so much initial learning up front. I think a lot of people are turned off by it, but once you get into them, they're not that difficult to learn. The hardest part is building the effective sheets and building the effective ways to communicate within your institution. But everybody had their favorite. So a lot of people would jump on. The chat was like blowing up with, oh, we love this one. And Smartsheet had a lot of great things on there, but there are a bunch of different ones out there, and I don't really know enough about the rest of them, but I felt like the presentation was good because it showed all the different ones that are available. Because it's like I always tell people, Smartsheet is just the tool for us to communicate efficiently and effectively with one another. If it left tomorrow, we would still be able to take everything on here, download it, and put it in another system to use. So it's not that we want to build it so that you're so dependent on that program or that company, because who knows what's going to happen with that company. So so it was just interesting to hear everybody had their diehard favorites. A lot of the discussion too was that you had people on the floor or across the museum using it, and then trying, the discussion was, how do I get our administration, our senior managers on board with seeing how this could really help us across the museum. And so that was an interesting aspect of it as well. So there was because some people, it was starting top down, some institutions were starting bottom up. It was just really interesting to see how a lot of people are coming at it in different ways, but I think that's the beauty of it. You need to make it work for your institution. So I just thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, I attended that session as well, and large scale buy-in was an interesting topic, but it seemed like a lot of them started with a small group of people working on a specific project, and then it spread from there.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you. I'm looking it up right now. Smart sheet anyway. I'm sure there were many, but
Oh, believe me, I could spend hours telling you about it, but nobody wants to hear it, but it's fascinating.
I was gonna say, if you make that offer, you may regret it, because there may be
It's true.
Any other interesting sessions or conversations that popped up at conference, or just conversations we want to start here?
I actually have a question. My name is Kelsey. I'm from the New York Hall of Science in Queens, New York City. And I could be really behind on this. It's kind of been very chaotic at the New York Hall of Science lately, but how are we going with like the dashboard upgrade? Like, how is that progressing and moving forward? And I just was curious about it because COVES has kind of been pushed to the side since we were closed again, but I was just wondering.
yeah, that's a great question. And I know, Kelsey, I hope you guys are like moving through your very challenging situation in New York as well as can be hoped for. So thinking about you all. But we are actually quite close to sort of transitioning everybody off of the COVID-19 sort of dashboard that we were using back to your old ones. It's been relatively easy to kind of merge things and make the old data talk to the new data again. So you can go back and see all of your institution specific questions. There are going to be a couple of differences that, we could build up and fix, but might take a little bit more time. And some of those are just related again to the variables that we used to create in the data cleaning. And that includes things like there was a variable that was like fiscal year, July to June, and calendar year, which was sort of simpler than using the dashboard sort of select a date range. And so we tried to make some of those things a little bit easier. Some of those things are pretty easy to reproduce. Some of them are a little bit more complicated. I was kind of going back and forth about whether to share the dashboard before all of those little details are ready. But I think Ryan pointed out that it's probably more important to, share data back with folks and build up those little things as needed, or work on the ones that people are saying are the most urgent after they've started sort of getting back into their dashboards and using them. So I hope to be able to share those with you all soon, hopefully by the end of the month. I'll say that. Yeah, we're just kind of moving forward on it. But Kelsey, if you have any specific questions about things about your data or about anything at NISA, definitely reach out and we can help you get what you need in the interim.
Yeah, I mean, currently, since we're closed, we're not collecting anything, but we have 2 short months that we were open and we do have all the data from that. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's awesome. I just wanted to make sure that mine wasn't showing errors or anything because it still didn't seem to be fully had the data, but thank you so much for that.
And just to state the obvious, because it does overlap with Chris's comment earlier, which is, or Alex's analysis earlier, which is, bringing those dashboards back to kind of familiar territory, or so that they're all inclusive and not just the COVID-19 version, means for many of you, integrating data across methodologies, right? Email and in person, the complications of that, or even doing your own analysis like Alex did, trying to decipher the net promoter score for members who were emailed the survey or, randomly sampled on site. So those things add just a little bit more complication in addition to things. So it may be, I'll talk to Sarah and Alex and some others about this, but maybe we just want to say the dashboards will be ready soonish, but maybe we should have a COP call where we say like, hey, we're going to walk through what you're going to see, what's different, what's missing, and how to find it, from the old stuff to the new stuff. Sarah's clapping her hands like that's a good idea. So maybe like December-ish. And I say December-ish because even though we're not done with this call, we do have a topic planned for November, which we're pretty excited about. I see Caitlin on this call. I don't think I see Rachel Wolf, but we are hoping to ask for some guest speakers. Yeah, Caitlin. To reprise the VSA webinar you guys are doing. Do you want to just give like a 1-minute overview of what you are talking about as a teaser?
Yeah, for which one, the Fig chat?
Yeah.
So we wanted to kind of talk about how to disseminate research across our institutions, because we sort of feel like we often have a lot of data that sort of lives with our research team, but having sort of institution-wide literacy about what we know and how we know it, and kind of avoiding like a couple little tidbits that keep popping up in lots of meetings, but maybe are from several years ago or not as relevant. So we wanted to kind of bring all that together. So Rachel's going to talk about how her museum is using regular data checkups and talk about COVES. And then Hannah LaFrance from Cleveland Museum of Art is going to talk about some of the data literacy work they've done at the Cleveland Museum of Art and with other museums. So that's coming up on the 25th.
And I'm not sure if Rachel has asked you yet, Caitlin, but we're hoping to bring that directly to the community of practice for November's call, which I believe is on the 16th.
Oh, fabulous. Good.
Yeah, just kind of reignite that conversation for this group, talk about sharing data internally, layering COVES data with other sources you have, and ways to just make sure COVES gets out there, but not by itself, right? It is in service to other data sources and other decisions being made. So we can continue that conversation. We're really looking forward to it. And then again,
I hadn't heard that. That's awesome. I'm excited now. Yeah, great.
And then, like thinking about dashboards, because that is one of the primary tools we use to get our COVES data out. So we can see the reconfigured version a little bit later and have a conversation for our whole team around some of those changes later in the year. I like this group planning. We should do this for all of our meetings, just kind of set an agenda out in advance. It makes our lives a little bit easier.
Yeah,
So
and I started clapping about returning to the dashboard and walking through, because that feels like it'd be a good annual activity for us. Just and maybe there are ways that you all can pull your colleagues on to learn or relearn dashboard stuff, because I know that we don't all hop into it regularly enough to feel like we know what we're doing really easily all the time.
And just because I've gotten a couple chats about it, we can say, in addition to posting this recording for anybody who missed the call or wants to just catch up on the latter half, for example, to YouTube, we can send out the resources that we shared in the chat, along with a PDF of the slides that Alex presented at the beginning for the community, in case there's any need or desire to reference those or share those internally. So we'll send like a little recap email out following this meeting. So otherwise, we'll say thank you all for attending this month's Community of Practice. We wish we were in person. We look forward to the next opportunity to get together in person and be able to host a COVES convening at a conference or anything like that. If anyone has specific questions that they didn't want to bring up for the full group, Alex, Sarah, and I will stick around for another few minutes just in case you want to chat more privately. But otherwise, have
everyone.
a wonderful end of your October. Gosh, I can't believe it's October 19th already. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Bye, everyone.